tell you all a story about my friend, Carolyn. About 50 years ago, Carolyn was in an NHS hospital. She was getting strapped into a chair and administered with electric shocks, while pictures of women were projected onto the wall. Back then, this was known as aversion therapy, and the goal was to make Carolyn associate femininity with pain and humiliation and disgust. The goal was to suppress her trans identity. It's disgusting, isn't it? It's horrifying. But the doctors that were torturing Carolyn thought they were helping her. They thought being trans was an illness, and the pain that they were inflicting right now was worth it if she could only live what they thought of as a normal life. It took years for Carolyn to leave those rooms behind. It took decades before she lived as her true self. And today she spends a lot of her time telling her story, part of a campaign to end conversion practices. Because although experiences as severe as Carolyn's are rare today, conversion practices are still part of the day-to-day life of lesbian, gay, bi, trans and queer people like me. Around 5% of us have been pushed to engage with a conversion practitioner. Around 3% of us have been directly harmed. Make no mistake, this is about homophobia, biphobia and transphobia. This is a world that wants to reshape my community into an image they find more acceptable. So what do these practices look like now? Conversion practices, at root, are forms of abuse, and their goal is to change or suppress a person's sexual orientation or their gender identity. And some of these practices are faith-based. About half of the practices in the UK are faith-based, for instance. So you might think here of deliverance prayer or prayer vigils or exorcisms. Some of these practices are secular, so abusive pseudo-psychotherapy or depriving people of their material needs or isolating people socially. And although severe forms of conversion practices are rare, they do still happen. There are still cases in the UK of so-called corrective rape. There are still cases in the UK where people are made to ingest toxic substances as part of religious rituals. Now, none of this works. None of this fixes us because we are who we are. We don't need to be fixed. But there is a mountain of evidence that conversion practices harm us and can cause long-term harm to the mental health of survivors. So for some years, there has been a campaign here and around the world to ban these practices. And it's part of a much longer journey, and that's a journey that started in the mid-20th century, with a time where we thought of being LGBTQ+ as abnormal, immoral, ill, and has travelled all the way to now, where most of us just accept being LGBTQ+ as part of natural human diversity. About 4 years ago, the UK was in a pretty good place, so the then Prime Minister, Theresa May, stepped forward and committed to legislating to ban conversion practices. She called them disgusting. She said they have no place in a modern Britain. I agree with her, 100%. 2 years ago, the UN Special Expert on Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity and Sex Characteristics produced a global report on conversion practices. He said, all practices seeking conversion are inherently humiliating, degrading and discriminatory, and he called for a worldwide ban. Now, 16 countries all over the world have already stepped forward and banned conversion practices. Countries like Ecuador and Brazil, countries like France and Canada, but not the UK. 4.5 years after Theresa May committed to banning conversion practices, they are still legal here. Why? Is it not still a problem? I want to tell you about Liam. So Liam was in his early 20s when he confided in his pastor about his gender identity and his sexual orientation. And when his pastor offered help, Liam wanted it. Liam welcomed it. But what the pastor, the pastor's wife, the church counsellor told Liam over and over again was that he had embraced a lie that came from the devil. That his gender identity and his sexual orientation was evil. That he was on a path that could only lead him to hell. They prayed over Liam for hour after hour. They asked repetitive, intrusive questions about his sexual feelings. They called him by the wrong name. They called him by the wrong gender, day after day, week after week. He says, if I was being told that even God couldn't bear who I am, then it was, and sometimes still is, very difficult to believe I am worthy of love. In fact, trans people are one of the highest risk groups for conversion practices in the UK. They are twice as likely to be pushed to engage with a conversion practitioner. They are twice as likely to be harmed compared to cis, lesbian, gay, bi, queer people like me. And although there isn't a huge body of evidence of the impact specifically on trans survivors, because as Carolyn's story tells us, until really recently we thought trans people were ill and should be cured, the research that does exist is clear that conversion practices can cause long-term mental health problems in trans people. All of the UK's leading medical bodies, from the British Medical Association and the NHS to the Royal College of Psychiatrists, are committed to a ban that protects trans people. Inclusive faith leaders are committed to a ban that protects trans people. The LGBTQ+ community and voluntary sector is committed to a ban that protects trans people. You, the general public, support a ban that protects trans people. But the current intention of the UK's policymakers is to implement a ban that protects cis, lesbian, gay, bi and queer people like me and leaves our trans family unprotected. Why? What they say is that banning conversion practices that target trans people is somehow more complicated than banning these practices when they target people like me. They say there's a need to do further work in order to protect what they describe as legitimate therapies supporting those experiencing gender dysphoria, especially those under the age of 18. I want to pause for a minute and let you know that children and young people are the primary targets of conversion practices. They are the primary targets of conversion practices because families and communities want to remake LGBTQ+ children into an image they find more acceptable. What kind of legitimate therapy could you give to a child that would fall foul of a ban on conversion practices, when the only thing that ban forbids is forms of abuse that seek to suppress or change that child's gender identity or sexual orientation? How can a trans child need less protection than a cis child? How can a trans child need less protection than a trans adult? Right now, somewhere in the UK, a parent is getting ready to pick up the phone and call someone who they truly believe is going to help their child. Having their child come out as trans has left them feeling scared. It's left them feeling confused. They have been overwhelmed with misinformation online and in the news. They've been told that being trans is an illness, that being trans is contagious. They've been told that children and young people are coming out as trans because it's cool. They've been told that children and young people are being groomed to come out as trans. That parent has been made to feel like any loving parent, any responsible parent intervenes and keeps intervening until their child simply stops saying they are trans or even questioning their gender identity. That parent is going to pick up the phone and call a conversion practitioner who is going to harm their child. This will happen next week. It will happen the week after. And it will keep happening while conversion practices that target trans people remain legal here in the UK. It will keep happening until we do something about it. It's not difficult or complicated to ban conversion practices. It's been done in country after country around the world, quickly and well. But it does require a commitment to the human rights of all LGBTQ+ people. The right to live our lives without discrimination, the right to experience our own health, the right to be protected from torture and inhuman and degrading treatment, the rights of the child. Under policymakers' current intentions, these are to be protected for cis, lesbian, gay, bi and queer people, but not for trans people. The rights of trans people are limited, contingent, it's complicated. Because we live in a world in which trans people's rights are boundaried by transphobia and by the discomfort and confusion that many cis people still feel about trans lives and identities. Conversion practices are just one example of the way in which transphobia and cis people's confusion and discomfort limits trans people's human rights and harms their day-to-day lives. I could have come here today to speak to you about transphobic abuse online. I could have come here today to speak to you about bullying in schools. I could have come here today to speak to you about exclusion in the workplace. I could have come and talked about the wave of transphobic hate crime in our streets or the abuse that too many trans people experience in their own homes. Because we are living through a manufactured moral panic that targets the trans community. Our press, our politics is flooded with transphobic talking points. Under all of it, we can hear a heartbeat of transphobia. The lie that being trans is unnatural. The lie that being trans is an illness, is contagious. The lie that trans people pose a risk to the cis majority. This is a problem that cis people like me and you have created. It's our job to fix it. So I want to invite you to join with me and support the campaign to ban conversion practices for all LGBTQ+ people, no exceptions. I want to invite you to think about the idea that trans rights are human rights, an idea that should be simple, straightforward, obvious, but somehow right now isn't. And I want you with me to commit that we will do something in our day-to-day lives that makes this society safer for trans people. The time for complacency is long, long past. If we want to live in a world where LGBTQ+ people can be free to live our fullest lives, then we are all going to have to fight for it. Thank you.